Now on BBC Two, a provider of news, entertainment and health advice. The role of the BBC in the Second World War.
This is the BBC programme for the forces.
BBC Home Service. Good morning, everybody. Here is the first news bulletin for today, Friday, January the 10th.
Half an hour, the blackout is lifted in order to welcome that man again.
The BBC kept you informed of what was going on. You knew that 3 ships had got through, and you knew that so-and-so had made a push, and that the Germans had failed there, and the boys were gradually pushing Rommel back in the desert. Boy, this is... You're praying for it, and it's happening. Now, you wouldn't know a thing without the BBC.
An unconfirmed report received today told of...
Well, I think the most remarkable achievement of the BBC is that it succeeded in producing objective news, as objective as one possibly could be in a life and death struggle of existence.
Ici, Londres.
In the end, what validates propaganda is victory. If we had lost the war, the BBC would have been blamed for a great deal of it. We won the war, and so the BBC received a lot of credit.
Eine Aufnahme.
This is London. You will now hear a statement by the Prime Minister.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning...
On September the 3rd, 1939, the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, told the nation over the BBC that peace negotiations with Hitler had finally broken down.
And that consequently, this country is at war with Germany.
At the beginning of the war, the government had given little thought to the role of the BBC.
Several ministers were quite determined that the BBC should be closed down altogether, and it's said that even the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, said people will have no time for it. But of course, there is a justification for that in a sense, because they were anticipating a war of absolute crash bombing from the very word go, and everybody either wiped out or fighting for their lives. And in those circumstances, one can understand that broadcasting wasn't going to play a very big part.
Closing of places of entertainment. All cinemas, theatres, and other places of entertainment are to be closed immediately until further notice.
But the BBC remained on the air. With nowhere else to go for entertainment, people turned to their radios, only to be disappointed.
The BBC had its own theatre organ, and Sandy McPherson was its staff organist. And poor man, he really did seem to be chained to his instrument, because he had to go on playing and playing to fill up the time.
And now we have a very good harp here too. I'll just play you a bit on that. And if it's drums you want, we have them.
There were complaints from listeners. Jack Page from Monmouth wrote,
"Is he at the organ morning, noon and night?"
From Surrey, Rosamond Mannering complained,
"We should like to know if you keep Sandy McPherson chained up in the dungeons of the BBC. Is there no one else to entertain us?"
Official information and instruction will be given over the wireless.
Very soon, the government realized the BBC had a use to broadcast public information. Auntie would tell the nation what to do.
Keep pencil and paper by your wireless set.
The Ministry of Home Security warns all civil defense and ARP services to be on the alert. The ministry states that the carrying of gas masks by the public has once more become necessary.
What I remember most of all is the boredom of it. Every government department wanted access to the BBC in order to read out over the air its interminable announcements about the emergency provisions that wonderful department was creating and setting up in order to help the public in time of war, and to impose all these regulations upon us. Incredibly boring.
There were demands in the press for brighter broadcasting. As Britain went to war, the BBC came under fire. The Daily Herald commented,
"What has happened to the BBC? Its programmes since the war began have been almost beneath contempt."
The Sunday Chronicle complained,
"We never realised before how inhuman and colourless the BBC voice could be."
We'll meet again.
Programme makers soon realised they would have to respond with human interest stories. The first was news of the children evacuated from London.
We're on number 12 platform at Waterloo Station. Train's in, and the children are just arriving, coming along in their school groups, tiny tots in front, leading up to the bigger one, 12, 13-year-olds behind, and here comes the high school. More like 14, 15 and 16. They're being evacuated too.
Many children went overseas, most to Canada and the USA, and the BBC broadcast its first radio link-up of the war.
British children in Canada and the United States speak with their parents across the Atlantic. And now let's contact Britain. This is WNAC in Boston calling Roy Rich in the BBC studios in London.
And what about the school? Are there any little boys in your school?
Yeah.
Oh, are there?
How do you like them?
Do you like having boys in the school?
They're okay.
Oh, they're okay.
All the boys at St. John's are listening, you know.
Oh, yes? Oh, boys, good luck.
Rather.
And, Daddy, I haven't received the £5 yet.
In France, there was no action at the front, and for the BBC's first war reporter, news stories were difficult to find.
We're standing in the pouring rain at the side of a French road. A road squelching with mud and lined right away over the plain to the far skyline with the inevitable double row of poplars. It's a grey, cold, dismal day. Coming down the road towards us is a battalion that I know to be of a famous Irish regiment. As they passed us on that road, their brown capes glistening, their tin hats perched on their heads, I thought how similar this must be to pictures of the last war. The road, the trees, the rain, and the everlasting beat of feet.
This is the BBC programme for the forces.
The Forces programme brought the same broadcasts to listeners in Britain and abroad. Radio had begun to form the link between the soldier overseas and his family at home.
Hitler can't kid us a lot of secret weapons down me rod. You ought to see what the sergeant's got down on the Maginot Line.
This is the BBC programme for the forces.
Bandwagon, presented by Harry S. Pepper and Gordon Cryer.
Bandwagon, come on and make a trip upon the bandwagon. It's a wild voice, it's a grand wagon. Come on.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again Bandwagon brazenly presents Chestnut Corner. Now listen to me. Where do the motor horns come from? China. What part of China? Hong Kong. Thanks, Dave and Joe. Now, where are we? Would you like to see a photograph of me taken when I was in hospital? Rather. Here you are, I'm in the end bed. If the end bed's empty. Is it? I must have got out for a minute.
Land of
the BBC Home Service. Here is a short news bulletin. The German army invaded Holland and Belgium early this morning by land and by landings from parachutes. The armies of the Low Countries are resisting.
The great thing that's required in any war, of course, is news, news, news. There's an insatiable demand for news. After all, life is at stake. You know, husbands and sons and brothers are out there risking their lives, and people at home want to know what's happening. How's it going? How's it moving? So news is what is required more than anything else.
On the 10th of May 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. Within a month, he faced the disaster of the shattered Allied armies retreating from Dunkirk.
One thing I remember about it, and I said to my wife, I've got to pack a bag, I'm going to Dover. And so she said, what are you going to Dover for? So I said, well, they're going to create literally a human chain between Dover and Dunkirk, and we're going to take part in it.
Soon after dawn this morning, I watched 2 warships steaming in, one listing heavily to port under the enormous load of men she carried on her decks. All of them were tired. Some were completely exhausted. But the most amazing thing was that practically every man was reasonably cheerful, and most of them managed to smile. Even when a man was obviously on the verge of collapse from sheer fatigue, you could still tell by his eyes that his spirit was irrepressible. And so the men of the BEF came home.
But what was not reported, and if you like, that was a suppression of facts, but it was something which would have encouraged the Germans very much had we said the men had been lining up to board ships and getting on board the first ship that they came to and throwing their rifles away. But it was not reported. It was, in fact, a disaster.
We were on the quayside, and we saw all the Red Cross with food and with clothing, because quite a lot of the soldiers, of course, had no clothes on at all because they'd had to swim from the beaches to the boats. Afterwards, of course, there was the wounded were looked after by the Red Cross, and the terrible thing was that the Germans were dive-bombing them all the way across. I know some of the small ships never came back.
You could switch on the radio and get the news. And it was, although it was censored fairly heavily, people did trust it to a certain extent. You could sort of guess when you believed what they were saying. We never got defeated in any battle. We made strategic withdrawals.
The BBC followed the government line in transforming the tragedy of defeat into a miracle of deliverance. The writer, J.B. Priestley, created a radio legend about the small ships of Dunkirk.
This little steamer, like all her brave and battered sisters, is immortal. She'll go sailing proudly down the years in the epic of Dunkirk. And our great-grandchildren, when they learn how we began this war by snatching glory out of defeat and then swept on to victory, may also learn how the little holiday steamers made an excursion to hell and came back glorious.
It had taken just 5 weeks for France to collapse in the face of the German onslaught.
I was on duty on the day that France fell, and as I sat there, I was conscious of people from other parts of Broadcasting House coming and standing in the newsroom behind my desk, behind my shoulders, as I dictated this news to the typist. And then you could almost hear a swift intake of breath and God.
Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit upland. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States,
including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science.
He was God's gift to radio. He knew the first rule, that you had to talk to one person, not a million. In millions of homes up and down these islands, and elsewhere too, nothing happened but listening to the wireless whilst Churchill was on. The records of water companies, telephone companies, gas suppliers, electricity suppliers showed the demand going down, 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 and to nothing during that few minutes of Churchill's broadcast. Nobody went to spend a penny, nobody put the kettle on, nobody used the telephone, nobody did anything but sit there listening to Winston.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
A whole nation was now bound together by the wireless.
For the first time, we saw what a national leader or prime minister could do with the microphone. It had never had any power of that kind before.
Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling. Here are the Reichs.
The voice of Nazi propaganda over the airwaves, spreading rumours, lies and disaffection, was William Joyce, known to British listeners as Lord Haw Haw.
It cannot be said that Mr. Churchill's speech of yesterday held out much hope to the people of England.
I can hear in my head now this extraordinary way he came on the air. He had a way of pronouncing Germany as if the first syllable was chair. So he said, Germany calling.
Germany calling, Germany calling. There is still no indication that the British people are fully or even imperfectly informed as to the facts of the military situation. To judge by the BBC bulletins, they have no idea where the front is.
Britain now expected a German invasion. The Battle of Britain for supremacy in the air had begun. In Dover was Charles Gardner. The only way then of reporting from the field was to use a disc recorder like a gramophone set up in the boot of a saloon car.
Time you picked up the machines, they've gone. There are 1, 2, 3, oh, whoops, there's a dogfight going up there. There are 4, 5, 6 machines wheeling and turning round. Now, hark at the machine guns going. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, there's something coming right down on the tail of another. Here they go. They're going back up. Yes, they're being chased home, and how they're being chased home. There are 3 Spitfires chasing 3 Messerschmitts now. Oh, boy, look at them going, and look how the Messerschmitts... Hey, that is really grand. And there's a Spitfire just behind the first 2. He'll get them.
All the sky above Fort had trails of smoke, and Charles was standing there talking like mad into the microphone, getting frightfully excited, as though he was describing a football match.
Oh, boy, I've never seen anything so good as this. The RAF fighters have really got these boys taped. Our machine is catching up the Messerschmitt now. It's catching it up. It's got the legs of it, you know.
Gardner was used to do it for the sporting style. So he did it in sporting. It's real gotcha stuff. You know, he's got him. Go, down he comes. That's another one out of the way.
The report caused a public outcry, and Mr. Dornay described it in the Times as
revolting to all decent citizens.
It was because it was being heard in voice over the wireless in the way that people were accustomed to hear the latest situation in the test match or something, that they thought, my God, you know, the people are dying here.
Here is the midnight news. Up to 10 o'clock, 175 German aircraft had been destroyed in today's raids over this country.
At the height of the Battle of Britain, the BBC broadcast highly inflated figures of enemy losses.
The question, of course, of any of us who worked in it have to ask ourselves, were we telling the truth? Was the BBC broadcasting the truth about the war? But you have to realise that the only access you've got is what is permitted, and that really means to the daily bulletins issued by the high command of the forces. And I mean, to be a bit cynical about it, it has always struck me that in every war, the country that is broadcasting has always lost fewer planes than the enemy.
The figures for German losses were trebled by the Air Ministry, and the BBC broadcast government propaganda. Churchill had no doubts that the broadcasters should do exactly what they were told. He even contemplated taking over the BBC.
Remember, even Churchill used to speak about the BBC as the enemy within the gate. There were plenty of powerful voices within the government, within Parliament, and outside, who thought that in wartime the BBC should be a branch, a department of the Ministry of Information, and that it should openly be regarded as the voice of the government, the voice of Britain.
The Prime Minister even questioned the patriotism of the BBC. He described it dismissively as one of the major neutrals. He decided against a formal takeover, but there were still many ways in which the government could influence what was broadcast. The ministry planted Patrick Ryan in the corporation as Director of Home News. Every morning he received a government briefing.
He was a civil servant from say, 10 o'clock in the morning till 12 noon, and a BBC person for the rest of the day. But it was an extremely clever way of meeting the government's wishes and making sure that what the government wanted the BBC to do got done. The BBC wasn't independent. You couldn't expect it to be in wartime. The press wasn't independent either. Remember that censorship existed. Every word the BBC put out was censored both for security and for policy.
The most notable victim of the government censors was the writer J.B. Priestley. His broadcasts after the 9 o'clock news, attracting 10 million listeners, were abruptly cancelled when he suggested that those who had fled the country on the outbreak of war should have their property confiscated.
It was felt that Jack Priestley was slipping in left-wing thoughts into his broadcast. I think that was the main reason for ending his 9 o'clock reign.
On the 21st of March 1941, the BBC Board of Management recorded
Priestley series stopping on instructions of Minister.
Top of the bill, number 23.
St. Paul's Cathedral was the pivot of the main fire. All around it, the flames were leaping up into the sky. There the cathedral stood, magnificently firm, untouched in the very center of all this destruction. As I walked along the streets, it was almost impossible to believe that these fires could be subdued. I was walking between solid walls of fire. Roofs of shops and office buildings came down with a roaring crash. Panes of glass were cracking everywhere from the heat. And every street was crisscrossed with innumerable lengths of hose. Men were fighting the fires from the top of 100-foot ladders, shot up from the street. Others were pushing their way into the burning buildings, taking the jet to the core of the fire. There was a vast number of men there, and apart from occasionally helping to lay out a hose, I saw that there was nothing I could do to help.
Hitler planned to terrorize Britain into submission by bombing its cities. The Blitz posed the greatest problem of the war so far for the BBC. How to report death and destruction on the doorstep without destroying morale. It had to work within strict government guidelines. Every script, every bulletin was vetted by censors.
Nothing was allowed to go on the air which would give rise to disaffection. Nothing was allowed to go on the air which would have the effect of lowering the spirits of the people and affecting our cause.
Well, obviously here, where thousands spend more than 12 hours at a stretch, sanitation is of prime importance. Some people who haven't actually sheltered in the tube at night may be worried on that score. But Mr. Irvine here, who helps with the sanitary arrangements, will reassure them that the situation is well in hand.
Well, at the beginning, things were not too good. But now we have got everything in hand. And all is very clean. We got 60 conveniences, which we put up at 6:30 in the evening and take down again at 7 in the morning. then everything is cleaned and scrubbed.
Here is the news, read by Alvar Liddell.
Here is the news, read by Stuart Hibbert.
In the event of an invasion, the Germans planned to open a radio station in Britain, pretending to be the BBC. To avoid Nazi impersonation, newsreaders now identified themselves for the first time.
The news, and this is Bruce Belfridge reading it.
Newsreaders like Bruce Belfridge became household names to the listeners.
One particular chap I always remember, he said, well, you know, we like them all. They have different styles. They don't think they have. They speak very clear. They don't speak as though they come from Huddersfield or anything like that. But they're very clear, and we like them all. You know, we like, I tell you whom we like John Belfridge best. I said, well, why do you like? They said, do you know Bruce? I said, yes, I know Bruce Belfridge very well. Why do you like him particularly? And this chap said, took a deep breath, he said, well, you know, when they have all them communiques from the Air Force, and he's about Dorniers shot down, Spitfires, and how many bombers have been brought down, and how many we've defeated of the Germans. Well, you know, John Belfridge, he reads it as though he shot all buggers down himself.
Broadcasting House was now a target for German bombers. It was hit twice during the Blitz, the first time just as the 9 o'clock news was going on the air.
Bruce Belfridge was reading the news that night, and he'd just given the headlines and made the announcement that tonight's postscript was going to be given by Lord Lloyd, when there was suddenly this frightful crunch which was heard all over the country. And Belfridge said, tonight's postscript will be given by Lloyd Lord. But apart from that, he didn't make any other stumbling or mistake, and although bits of the ceiling were dropping down on his head, he managed to read the whole of the rest of the 9 o'clock news without a tremor in his voice at all.
Music highly welcome. We played to you this morning on Rhythmic Records.
A BBC memo instructed,
no slow foxtrots, dreamy numbers or vocals of the sob stuff order. Plenty of snap and punch. Just try to make the period one of unrelieved brightness and cheeriness.
The purpose was to keep them happy and working, because if they were happy, they'd work well. If they were depressed, they wouldn't work well. So they played this happy melody. And music while you work, and workers' playtime, of course, that was something to look forward to cheer them up. This was the importance of entertainment.
Ernest Bevin, Minister for Production, gave his full backing to the BBC's idea of taking entertainment straight to the factory canteen.
Ladies and gentlemen, workers' playtime. I'm a guy who's never going to roam again once I'm in the old hotel.
By and by, I'll see my little home again. Then I'm going to settle down
round the back of the armchair. Now this song love.
Workers' Playtime was praised by Ernest Bevin as a great contribution to production. He went further. The BBC is a factory of entertainment and education and must be regarded as one of the vital services. He recognized that what the wartime listener wanted was to be entertained.
There, a jolly